Gutter! It's a gutter! It's just a gutter.
Greetings, Sounds of the Mountain Storytelling patrons. Thank you for tuning in. I'm looking the wrong direction. Greetings, Sound of the Mountain Storytelling patrons. Thank you so much for tuning in. I so hope that you're enjoying these videos, but I hope even more that we can be back together at Camp Bethel next year in 2022. Now, several years ago, my buddy Skeeter and I decided that we were going to go out west to do a little bear hunting. Now, before you tune out of the story because you don't want to hear a story about a bear getting killed, trust me, no bears get killed in this story. They forfeited, so Skeeter and I won. I think the main reason we didn't even see any bear is because we were in a minivan. No self-respecting bear wants to get killed by a couple of dudes in a minivan. So, we started out from Morgantown, West Virginia, and we drove, 3/4 of the way across the country, heading out to Swan Lake in Flathead County, Montana. And we didn't have any trouble at all the entire way out there till we got off the interstate to head up to Swan Lake. And then we were on a 2-lane road that was probably 60 miles long, and we hadn't been on it very long when a mobile home pulled up behind us. Now, this thing was about 40 feet long, and there were 3 guys in it. And I know there were 3 guys in it because they were each leaned out a window and they were yelling stuff at us because, well, I guess they wanted to pass us. But this wasn't the sort of road that was designed for a 40-foot RV to pass a minivan. And those guys in that RV thought that that was our fault. So each one of them was leaned out a different window and they were screaming words at us. Now, they only knew about 3 words. Maybe they knew 5 words. Let's say they knew 5 words. But they could use those 5 words in sort of a tonal swear language that got their point across pretty well. And Skeet, he was driving the minivan, and he was saying things like, man, those guys, they're driving that thing like a summer assault vehicle. And then there was a wide spot in the road, and that motorhome shot out from behind us, tore off down the highway. And for about the next 40 miles, I had to listen to my best buddy in the whole world not finish a single sentence. He was like, if I ever, Jupiter, kind of like that. We finally got to the camp. I was never so glad to get anywhere in my life to finally get out of that van and quit listening to Skeeter not finish sentences about what he was going to do if he ever saw them 3 fellas again. So we drove over to our campsite and we started to unload the gear, and we were setting up the tent, and I looked all the way across the campground, and lo and behold, on the other side of the campground, there was that 40-foot RV with them 3 fellas still speaking their 5-word tonal swear language, only now they had a cooler out, and they were about a quarter way through that cooler, if you see what I'm saying. Well, I didn't say nothing. I didn't say nothing to Skeeter. I didn't point him out. I just figured eventually he'd see him and he would, maybe do something about his unfinished sentences. We got the tent set up. We got our gear stowed. We cooked a meal. Everything was going fine. It was starting to get dark. I finally turned to Skeeter. I couldn't stand it anymore. I said, Skeeter, don't you see those fellas over there? And he looked, and they were there. And by now they were about halfway through that cooler. And I said, Skeeter, I listened to you for 40 miles, not finish a sentence, telling me what you were going to do if you ever saw those guys again. Aren't you going to go over there and cause them fellas some trouble? And Skeeter looked at me, and he looked at them, and he looked at me, and he said, Bill, those look like the kind of guys that can cause themselves trouble. Let's just sit back and see what happens. So we sat back, and we watched, and it got darker, and those guys got deeper and deeper into that cooler. And after it was good and dark and they were good and deep in that cooler, them fellas realized that right on the other side of their campsite there was a barbed wire fence. And on the other side of that barbed wire fence was a herd of cows. And I guess those guys decided that they were going to do a little cow tipping. Now, maybe you don't know what cow tipping is. Maybe you grew up in some urban area and have never been exposed to a live bovine. But it is said that cows sleep with their knees locked, standing up, and you can walk up beside them and push them over. Apparently, it's a lot of fun for everybody but the cow. Those guys jumped that barbed wire fence and they started to drunkenly creep toward, nobody's ever drunkenly crept. They started to creep drunkenly toward those cows, and they got up to the first cow and put their hands on the side of it and knocked it over. And they were having a good old time. They knocked over a few more cows. They were having a great time. And then they noticed, all by itself, standing on a little knoll, maybe 10 yards away, just like on the back of an old nickel, there was a buffalo. And these guys decided that they were going to do a little buffalo tipping. Now, maybe you've heard of cow tipping in a sociology class or something like that, but I bet you've never heard of buffalo tipping. And the reason you've never heard of buffalo tipping is the same reason that you have never heard of alligator rolling or elephant tipping. And that's because these are bad ideas, which means that some man out there tried it, and he died a humiliating death. And his wife was so embarrassed that she just told people he ran off with a younger woman because that was easier to explain. But these guys got up beside that buffalo, and they put their hands on the side of the buffalo, and they started to push. Now, buffalo are a lot bigger than cows. And so as they started pushing that buffalo, he started not falling over. And I think what happens when you tip a cow is the cow gets about right here, and it wakes up, and it goes, huh? And then bam! It hits the ground. But the thing about when you tip a buffalo is you put your hands on the side of that buffalo, give it a little push. That buffalo gets about right here. He wakes up and he says, huh? And then things get nasty. That buffalo scraped the ground a couple of times and it took off after them fellas. And them fellas crossed that cow pasture and jumped that barbed wire fence with enough grace and agility to qualify for the International Inebriated Olympics. If only there were such a thing. That buffalo snorted around a while, and then he headed back to his knoll. Skeeter let those guys catch their breath, and finally he nudged me. And he said, come on, it's time to go cause those fellas some trouble. We walked over, we introduced ourselves, and finally one of them guys said, so, what are y'all doing here? And Skeeter said, oh, yeah. He said, we're out here, we're working on our doctoral theses. And they said, oh, what are you studying? And I got to tell you, I was just as interested as those fellas were to find out what we were studying. And Skeeter said, yeah, we're out here, we're studying supernatural bovine theology. Say what? Said one of them fellas. Skeeter said, yeah, we're studying the great cow goddess, Montina. They said, we ain't never heard of Montina. Skeeter said, sure you have. They named the whole state after her. And after that, he decided to go into the doctrine and dogma of the great cow goddess Montina. Skeeter said to those fellas, after they invited us to sit down, Skeeter said to those fellas, now, in the beginning was the herd, and the herd was good. And there was Montina, up there in the heavens, and you know, she created the universe, and she created all the different solar systems. She created the black holes and the different suns and the different kinds of stars, the blue stars, the red stars, the giant stars, all kinds of planets out everywhere. And then she created our solar system, Skeeter explained, and Montina created the planet Earth. And it was so beautiful, and Montina was kind of lonely, so Montina thought to herself, Skeeter explained, that she'd just create a couple of cows down there to live on this great planet Earth. And so, Skeeter said, she created the first two cows, Botox and Bowtie. And she put them down in the pasture of Eden. And she told them that they had free range of the place. They could do whatever they want except go and drink from the pond of life. Well, Botox and Bowtie had a pretty good time for a while, you know, and everything was new, stuff was fun, they were having a good time. But then, they started to get a little bit bored after a while, and they decided they were going to go just look. They weren't going to drink from the pond of life, heaven forbid. They were just going to go look at the pond of life. And they got down there, Skeeter explained, and when they got down to the pond of life, there was a frog. Now, as you've already probably figured out, this was no ordinary frog. This was a handsome, smooth-talking bull frog. And that bullfrog said to Botox and Bowtie, he said, if you kiss me, I'll turn into a bull prince. And one of them fellows said, hey, I think I have heard this story before. And I said, oh yeah, it's an old one. And so, Skeeter continued, Botox and Bowtie kissed that magic bullfrog, and sure enough, he turned into a bull prince, and he proceeded to show them some things that they might not have thought of on their own, and before long, Botox and Bowtie were with calf. Well, Montina got word of that. She wasn't happy, so she came down to the pasture of Eden, and she called for Botox and Bowtie, but they didn't come out. She called again. Finally, they came out, and she said, how come you were hiding? And they said, because we were naked and ashamed. And Montina said, you're not naked. You're cows. But then they told her the story of the bullfrog. And that's really the difference between this and the Adam and Eve story. And Skeeter said this, he winked to make sure that everybody knew that he was joking. He wasn't, coming down on the whole religion thing. He was just going to make a funny little joke here. So he winked, and he said the difference between this story and the Adam and Eve story is there's no bull in the Adam and Eve story. I told that joke wrong. Anyway, let's just go back to Botox and Bowtie. We're going to edit that little part out. So, Montina said, you're not naked, you're cows. But they told her the story, and Montina was so upset, Skeeter concluded, that she threw Botox and Bowtie out of the pasture of Eden and told them that from that point on, they would be ruled over by men in big hats with pointy boots. And with that, Skeeter finished the doctrine and the dogma of the great cow goddess, Montina. And those three fellas sat there, and they pondered that for a while. And then one of them said, well, how come you're studying that out here? And Skeeter looked at me like it was my turn. And I said, that's because we think this herd of cow right over here might be the sacred remnant of the original herd of Botox and Bowtie. And one of them fellas said, oh, well, are they protected by like federal law or something? And I said, they're protected by a force far greater than federal law. They're protected by the great cow goddess, Montina. And one of them fellas said, well, what would happen if you messed with them? I said, you didn't, did you? And they said, oh, no. Well, we might have. And they said, what would happen if you tried to tip one? And I said, you didn't, did you? And they said, oh, no. Well, we might have. And then I said, well, the one thing you got going for you is at least there was no bluffalo out in that field. And they said, oh, there was a buffalo. And I said, no, not a buffalo. I said a bluffalo. And they said, what's a bluffalo? I said, the bluffalo is the great spirit that Montina sends down to watch over her sacred herd. And they said, oh, there might have been a bluffalo out in that field. And I said, you didn't try and tip him, did you? And they said, no, well, we might have. And I said, oh, then you are in a lot of trouble, because the bluffalo is a great believer in the doctrine of an eye for an eye and a hoof for a hoof. And if you tried to tip the bluffalo, well, the bluffalo is going to come and try and tip you. And you don't want to be tipped by a bluffalo. That's like being tipped by a school bus. And those fellows said, well, what do we do? And I said, well, fortunately for you, it just so happens that the bluffalo is my direct line of scholarship and investigation. I said, I know a lot about the bluffalo, and here's what you can do. I said, you guys go in your camper there. You get in your camper, you lock the doors, you shut the windows, you pull the screens, you turn off all the lights, you lay down in your beds, and you assume the prone defense. Now, the prone defense isn't a defense you hear a lot about. You don't see a lot of football coaches, basketball coaches running up and down the sidelines yelling, go prone, go prone. It's more of a self-defense mechanism. But I figured that those fellows were just drunk enough that if they lay down on their cots, they'd fall asleep. So they jumped up and they started running toward their camper. And Skeeter said, remember, no matter what you do, no matter what you hear, no matter what you smell, y'all just stay down there in the prone defense. And they jumped in that camper, and the door shut, and the windows came down, and the blinds came down, and the lights went off, and Skeeter and I walked back to our campsite, sat there for about 45 minutes, and when we were pretty sure them guys were asleep, we snuck back over, and I put my ear up to the side of that camper and listened. I could hear them fellas in there snoring. So I made a couple of buffalo noises. Now, I used to make buffalo noises like this, but then me and my family went out to Yellowstone National Park. I don't know if you've ever been out to Yellowstone National Park, but we went out there, and when you're at Yellowstone, it's just like this one-lane road that goes through the whole park, and half of America is there. So you come over a little rise, and there'll be a traffic jam for 2 miles because there's a buffalo standing in the middle of the road 2 miles ahead, and all these other buffalo standing alongside. And if your car window's down, the buffalo will come and stick its head in your car and make a buffalo noise. So I learned exactly what a buffalo sounds like, and now, if you'll allow me, well, if you don't allow me, I guess just turn your head away because I'm doing it anyway. I would like to do my bluffalo impersonation. So, here we go. fine. That's fine if you're in a rental. But if you're in your own car, it's going to make kind of a mess. But I didn't know that back then. So I just made regular old buffalo noises, or what I thought were buffalo noises, just kind of, well, those guys didn't stir. So we set our plan into motion. Now here's what we did. I found what I thought was about the middle of that 50-foot RV, the frame of it, and I got a piece of firewood and I laid that flat on the ground. And Skeeter went and got his hydraulic jack. Now Skeeter's got a dandy of a hydraulic jack. It'll go up about 4 feet in about 30 seconds. He put it on that piece of firewood. He started to crank that baby up, and pretty soon that camper started to lean over just a little, and we heard the unmistakable bump, thump, 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 the sound of a very drunk men, rolling out of their cots and across the now inclined floor of their camper. And they started screaming, "The bluffalo! The bluffalo!" And I put my hands on the side of the camper, and I started to rock that camper back and forth. And pretty soon, well, it fell over. We were doing a little camper tipping now. It fell over, and it fell right across that barbed wire fence of the cow pasture. And I guess that buffaloes, or bluffalos, don't like large white rectangles dropping into their pasture in the middle of the night. As that bluffalo scraped the ground one more time, and he started running straight for that camper. And if there's one thing you can be sure of in this life, that the engineers who design RVs never ask themselves, they never once stopped to ask themselves, how are we going to buffalo-proof the roof of that RV? That buffalo went through the roof of that RV like a bullet through a bucket. You could hear it bouncing around on the inside. It sounded like when you shake a spray paint can, that little ball going around. And those three fellows were now climbing out the windows on top of their camper, and they were screaming. This was like Newton's first law, right? A body in motion tends to stay in motion, which is very similar to Skeeter's first law, which is a body being chased by the law tends to stay in motion. But they were pulling themselves up onto the roof of the camper, and they were screaming, "The bluffalo! The bluffalo!" And Skeeter said, "Save yourselves!" And they said, "What do we do?" And Skeeter said, "Take off all your clothes!" And 3 pair of underwear went flying through the sky. Men in extreme emotional distress will do amazing things. And I said, "Do the dance of the bluffalo!" And they said, "What's the dance of the bluffalo?" And I did my best Kevin Costner from Dancing with Wolves. And pretty soon, there were 3 naked men on the side of that RV doing the dance of the bluffalo. And even in the middle of nowhere, Montana, it does not take long for the authorities to get wind of that sort of situation. And pretty soon, a phalanx of police vehicles was coming down the road. And Skeeter and I just kind of headed back to our campsite, got in our tent, and we listened to the sweet, melodious sounds of 3 very drunk, very naked, very handcuffed men trying to explain to a very humorless sheriff just exactly why they were doing the naked dance of the bluffalo on the side of their camper in the middle of the night. And I turned to Skeeter and I said, "That was a pretty good plan." He said, Yeah, it was one of my best. He said, "I sure turned that summer assault vehicle into a somersault vehicle." The end. Thank you guys very much for listening.
Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Thank you for watching. A big shout out of thanks to our sponsors, and thank you for your donations to Camp Bethel and for tipping the performers. Use the donor buttons or the links on this page. Thanks.
We hope the festival will be back home in person next year and need your help in getting the camp ready to reopen as soon as possible for summer camps, guest groups, and special events like the festival. Please click on the link below and make your contribution toward the work, the fun, and the fellowship that find a home at Camp Bethel. Thanks for watching, and thank you for your gift.